Scientists swabbed the cheeks of men who had never met each other, living in different states, carrying different last names. And when the DNA results came back, the researchers went completely silent. Because what those results confirmed was not just a family connection. What they confirmed was that a woman who died over 100 years ago had been telling the truth about something the official historical record had quietly doubted for generations. And what her living descendants said next, about the roots, about the safe houses, about the names of the creek crossings that never appeared on any published map, is what makes this the most significant genealogical discovery tied to American slavery in decades. This is the story of Harriet Tubman, not the version in your textbook, not the single paragraph that reduces one of the most strategically brilliant people in American history to a woman who led people north. The real version, the one backed by modern DNA science, by archaeologists digging through Maryland marshland, by living descendants who have been sitting on verified family truth for nearly 2 centuries while official history politely ignored them. The version where science finally caught up to what the family always knew, and the results forced historians to rewrite what they thought they understood. Stay with me for this entire video, because the DNA confirmation is just the beginning of what was uncovered. The archaeology is more remarkable. The oral history the descendants are now sharing publicly is more detailed than anything that has ever appeared in print. And the reason Tubman herself made sure almost none of her methods survived in writing is a strategic decision, so precise, so deliberate, so ahead of its time that understanding it completely changes how you see everything else about her story. Let us start with who Harriet Tubman actually was before we talk about what the science found, because the textbook version genuinely does her a disservice. She was born Araminta Ross, the 5th of 9 children on the eastern shore of Maryland. Her parents were Benjamin Ross and Harriet Ritt Green, both enslaved on neighboring properties owned by different men. Her exact birth year is genuinely disputed among historians, with documented estimates ranging from 1815 to 1822. That 7-year gap is not a rounding error. It exists because enslaved births were rarely recorded with any consistency or care. The people being born were legally considered property, and property records were kept for the benefit of the owner, not the person being owned. Most modern researchers now favor 1822, but the debate has never been definitively closed, and that open question is itself a small but precise illustration of how thoroughly the historical record was built to serve the people who held power, not the people who had none. When she was a teenager, still enslaved, still called Minty by her family, a farm overseer threw a 2-pound lead weight at another enslaved man who was trying to escape. The weight missed its intended target and struck Araminta Ross directly in the head. The injury cracked her skull. She was given no medical treatment. She was sent back to work. For the rest of her life, she suffered sudden, unpredictable episodes where she would lose consciousness without warning, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes mid-step, waking minutes later with no memory of what had happened. Modern medical researchers looking at the historical record have identified these episodes as consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy caused by traumatic brain injury. She lived with this condition without treatment, without diagnosis, for the rest of her life. She was still the most effective operative the Underground Railroad ever produced. She escaped slavery for the first time in 1849, traveling alone, navigating 90 miles of unfamiliar terrain through the night, guided largely by the North Star and the knowledge of the land she had spent years absorbing while working timber crews alongside her father. She arrived in Philadelphia. She was free. She had nothing. She knew almost nobody. And her first documented reaction to her own freedom, recorded by a friend who heard her describe it, was that everything looked like a strange land, that she had crossed into a new world and her family had been left behind in the old one. Within a year, she went back. She went back 13 times, not once. 13 separate return trips into Maryland slave territory, where a substantial bounty had been placed on her head, where every white person she encountered represented a potential threat, where being recognized meant capture, re-enslavement, and the brutal punishment that enslavers reserved for people who had the audacity to successfully run. She guided an estimated 70 people to freedom across those 13 trips, including her own parents, her brothers, and other family members she was determined not to leave behind. She never lost a single person, not one. In 13 missions into hostile territory, operating with no backup, no legal protection, and no margin for error, she achieved a perfect operational record. Frederick Douglass, who knew her personally, wrote her a letter in 1868 that contains a line historians consider one of the most striking assessments one freedom fighter ever gave another. He told her that he knew of no one who had willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve others than she had. Coming from a man who had risked his own life and freedom for the same cause, that assessment carries significant weight. She was also a Union spy during the Civil War, leading armed scouts into Confederate territory in South Carolina, gathering intelligence that directly contributed to the Combahee River Raid of 1863. which freed more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. She was the first woman to lead an armed military operation in American history. She was not paid for this work by the federal government for more than 30 years after the war ended. She died in 1913 in Auburn, New York, where she had spent her final decades running a home for elderly Black Americans who had nowhere else to go. She had spent her life making sure other people had somewhere to go. She died with almost nothing. Now here's the part of her story that almost nobody taught correctly, and it is the part that makes the DNA discovery so meaningful. Tubman left almost no written record of how she did what she did on purpose. Every route she used, every safe house she trusted, every landmark she navigated by at night through terrain that could kill an inexperienced traveler, every name of every person who opened a door for her and the people she was guiding, nearly all of it exists today only in fragmentary oral accounts and the memories of families who passed the details down in private. This was not carelessness. This was strategy, so disciplined it is genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from a position of safety. Every piece of information written down about Underground Railroad operations while those operations were active was a potential weapon against the people still trying to escape. If a safe house was documented and that document was found, the people in that house faced imprisonment or worse. If a route was mapped and that map was captured, every person using that route was in immediate danger. Tubman understood this with absolute clarity. She kept her methods unwritten, not because she lacked the ability to communicate them, but because she understood that the safest secret is the one that exists in no form that can be confiscated, subpoenaed, or used against the people it was designed to protect. She protected the how so thoroughly that historians spent generations mistaking her silence for absence, treating the thin paper trail as evidence that the story itself was thin. It was never thin. It was protected on purpose, which is what makes the DNA confirmation so significant. The researchers who conducted the genetic study focused on a very specific tool, Y chromosome analysis. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how Y chromosome testing works and what it can and cannot confirm, because the scientists involved have been precise about this distinction, and it deserves to be stated clearly. A Y chromosome passes almost entirely unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, along an unbroken male line. It accumulates very small, measurable changes over time, called markers, and those markers can be compared between men to determine how closely related they are and how many generations separate them from a shared common ancestor. The more markers tested, the sharper and more statistically confident the picture becomes. Researchers on this project recommended testing over 100 separate marker points on the Y chromosome of each participant, specifically because more markers produce more precise results with less room for ambiguity. Here is the critical technical honesty the researchers were upfront about. A Y chromosome test cannot examine Harriet Tubman's own DNA directly. She was a woman. She carried no Y chromosome. The test cannot access her mother's side of the family, and no verified biological sample of Tubman herself exists anywhere today. What the test can do, precisely and powerfully, is trace the paternal line she was born into, the line running through her father Ben Ross, by testing living men who descend from Ben Ross through his sons. Ben Ross had multiple sons. Several of those sons changed their surnames after emancipation, taking the name Stewart, a common practice among formerly enslaved people separating themselves from records tied to enslavement or simply choosing their own name for the first time in their lives. On paper, tracking a family that splits across Ross and Stewart branches, moving through different states, across multiple generations, through a historical period where Black family records were routinely incomplete, destroyed, or never created at all, becomes extremely complicated very quickly. Standard genealogical paper research runs directly into the wall that has blocked Black American family history research for generations. Records deliberately incomplete. Marriages never legally recognized. Surnames assigned or reassigned at the convenience of people who had legal authority over other human beings. A chromosome testing cuts straight through that wall. If men descending from different sons of Ben Ross carry closely matching markers across over 100 tested points, that match is mathematically strong evidence that those men share the same paternal ancestor, confirming the family tree from the biological record rather than relying solely on paper that may not exist or may have been deliberately destroyed. Multiple men descending from different branches of the Ross family, tracing back through Tubman's siblings, submitted samples over the course of the project. The results confirmed the line ran unbroken. Every branch tested matched. The same paternal ancestor connected every participant exactly as the family's oral history had insisted for generations, now confirmed by genetic data rather than memory alone. For families in this country whose paper trail was deliberately broken by the institution of slavery, that confirmation is not a minor academic footnote. It is a scientifically verifiable anchor point that no lost courthouse record, no fire, and no dismissive historian can argue away. It is proof in a form that does not depend on the goodwill or the record-keeping accuracy of people who had every institutional reason to keep black family histories incomplete. Now here is where the second discovery comes in, and this is where the story moves from genetics into the actual ground Tubman walked. While genealogists were working on the bloodline confirmation, a completely separate team of archaeologists in Maryland was independently chasing physical proof of where Tubman actually came from. In November of 2020, a team led by chief archaeologist Dr. Julie Shablitsky began searching a stretch of land called Peter's Neck on Maryland's eastern shore, recently acquired by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. They were looking for the buried, physical remains of a cabin belonging to Ben Ross, Harriet Tubman's father. Understanding how difficult this search actually was matters to appreciating what finding it meant. The team was working from land deeds and wills more than 150 years old, cross-referencing property boundaries that had shifted, been renamed, subdivided, and legally transferred many times over since the 1800s. They were searching wetland terrain that has been shaped and reshaped by tides and seasons for 2 centuries, looking for a wooden structure gone for generations, leaving behind nothing but whatever small, durable objects the soil might still hold. Wooden structures do not last in Maryland marsh. What the team was hunting for was the invisible outline of a life, preserved only in the objects small enough and hard enough to survive in wet ground for 150 years. In March of 2021, they found it. Nails, broken glass, fragments of dishware, a button, and a coin dated 1808, sitting undisturbed in the same ground where it had been dropped or placed or lost by a family still living in slavery more than 2 centuries before the archaeologist's brush touched it. The property itself carried documented history that aligned precisely with what the family had always said. Records showed a man named Anthony Thompson had legally bequeathed 10 acres of that specific land to Ben Ross, with a written promise that Ross would be granted his freedom 5 years after Thompson's own death. Thompson died in 1836. Ross received both his freedom and those 10 acres in the early 1840s, exactly as the legal document specified. This gave researchers a documented paper trail pointing directly to the same 10 acres they eventually excavated. The paper and the soil confirmed each other. Dr. Shablitsky described what the discovery meant beyond the objects in the display case. This was not simply Ben Ross's home in a biographical footnote sense. This was the specific ground where young Araminta Ross, the child who would become Harriet Tubman, spent real time as both a child and a teenager. This was where she worked alongside her father, supervising timber crews for the man who legally owned them both. This was where she learned the wetlands, the tides, the hidden paths through marsh terrain that would look to an outsider like impassable wilderness, but that she learned to read like a map written in water and mud. The survival skills she used to guide dozens of people through southern terrain at night without a lantern, without a trail, without any visible path that an untrained person could follow, those skills were built on this specific ground, at the same location that archaeology just confirmed was real. Standing at the announcement of that discovery was Douglas Mitchell, Ben Ross's great-great-great-grandson. He watched state and federal officials publicly confirm with physical evidence the existence of ground his own family's oral history had been pointing to for generations before any researcher showed up with a shovel. Think about what that moment actually represents, not just for him personally, for every member of a family who told that story and was never fully believed because they had no documentation, because their truth lived only in spoken words passed down at kitchen tables. And now consider what both discoveries together mean. One confirmed through genetics that the bloodline the family had always claimed was real, backed by over 100 genetic markers matching across multiple branches descending from different sons of the same man. The other confirmed through soil and buried objects that the specific ground the family had always pointed to was exactly where they said it was, backed by physical artifacts and legal documents that independently corroborated each other. Neither discipline alone delivered both halves of that proof. Genetics and archaeology, working in complete independence of each other, arrived at the same place from 2 entirely different directions, confirming the same family story that had been sitting in spoken form for nearly 2 centuries, waiting for someone to take it seriously. Now let us talk about what the descendants are sharing now that the confirmation is established, because this is the part that historians are paying closest attention to. Descendants interviewed about their family's oral history describe details that do not appear in any published academic account of the Underground Railroad, not partial overlaps with documented routes, specific details that exist only in family memory. The name of a particular creek crossing used to move from one section of marsh to another without leaving detectable tracks on dry ground. Specific farm properties in the region, identified not by the owner's name on the deed, but by a physical feature of the building that made it recognizable at night. Landmarks within the marsh itself, the kind of navigational reference points that only make sense to someone who has moved through that terrain repeatedly and knows where the solid ground is underneath what looks like uniform wetland from any distance. Several descendants have described elder relatives referencing specific safe points along routes that do not correspond to any location on published Underground Railroad maps. Not because those locations did not exist, but because Tubman's operational security was so thorough that they never made it into any record that historians could find through standard archival research. The family kept those details alive in exactly the way Tubman would have wanted: spoken, private, passed to the next generation by someone who understood that some information stays safe only when it stays out of writing. One great-great-grandniece has spoken publicly about the experience of meeting strangers at public events who simply want to be in physical proximity to someone who carries Tubman's bloodline. People who treat that proximity as a kind of historical connection that no photograph or textbook can replicate. She describes it without dismissing those people, understanding that what they are reaching toward is something real, a living thread back to a story that shaped the country they live in. Here's the detail that ties the physical and historical together in a way that nobody planned and that carries its own weight. The land at Peter's Neck, the actual ground where Tubman learned to read the Maryland Marsh as a young woman, is projected by the Federal Wildlife Service to naturally convert to open water by approximately 2100. Rising sea levels are slowly reclaiming the wetland terrain that Tubman used to navigate people to freedom. The specific geography she learned so precisely that she could move dozens of people through it in darkness, the tidal patterns, the areas of solid ground hidden inside what looked like impassable marsh, the natural features she used as reference points, because they were more reliable than any road. That geography is disappearing. The same Federal Wildlife Service that purchased the property to protect it specifically noted this timeline. Acquiring that stretch of Maryland marsh served two purposes simultaneously: protecting a vulnerable coastal habitat and preserving the physical stage where documented American history happened before rising water made the question permanently unanswerable. That overlap is not a coincidence anyone engineered. It is simply the reality that the physical landscape and the genetic bloodline are both being documented and confirmed in roughly the same narrow historical window, before the marsh disappears to water, and before the generation of elders who carry the most detailed oral memory passes without those details being properly recorded. Now, let us sit honestly with what this entire body of work actually represents, because this is the part that deserves the most direct statement. This was never one single discovery made by one team. It was two separate teams working in two separate scientific fields, years apart, with no coordination between them, independently confirming two separate halves of a story that generations of Tubman's own family had never stopped telling. The genealogists were not trying to validate the archaeologists. The archaeologists were not trying to validate the genealogists. Both teams were following their own scientific questions toward their own documented evidence. That they both ended up reinforcing exactly the same family account, from completely different directions, using completely different methodologies, is not something either team could have designed in advance. It is what happens when the family was right all along. And that is where this story lands on something larger than one woman's biography, as extraordinary as that biography is. Tubman was born into a system that was legally and institutionally designed to make her history difficult to document, difficult to trace, and easy to dismiss. Enslaved births were not recorded with care. Enslaved marriages had no legal standing. Enslaved people were routinely referred to in records by first name only, or by a number, or not referred to at all. The paper trail that white American families used to trace their ancestry back through generations simply did not exist in the same form for black American families, not because black families did not have a history worth documenting, but because the people who controlled the documentation had no interest in creating it. When emancipation came, the paper wall did not disappear. It shifted. Families chose new surnames that left no documentary connection to the names that appeared in pre-war records. People moved across state lines looking for work, for safety, for family members sold to other states before the war. The legal and social infrastructure that might have supported family record keeping for newly freed people was never adequately built. The result is that black American genealogy runs into documented, systematic historical obstacles that most white American families never encounter and often do not know exist. What genetics and archaeology together have done for the Tubman family is not simply resolve a question about one famous person's bloodline. They have demonstrated that the tools now exist to confirm family truths that the paper trail cannot reach, to give families a scientifically verifiable anchor point that no lost document, no destroyed courthouse, and no dismissive historian can undermine, to take oral history seriously as evidence rather than treating it as a secondary source that requires paper confirmation before it deserves credence. Because the question this leaves hanging is the one that matters most. If a family's own testimony about their bloodline and their land could sit unconfirmed by official history for nearly 200 years, only to be independently validated the moment genetics and archaeology finally turned their tools toward it, what does that tell you about every other black family in this country still sitting on verified truth that science simply has not gotten around to confirming yet? How many families have an oral tradition as specific, as consistent, as geographically detailed as what the Tubman descendants described, but no research team has yet shown up with the tools to prove them right? How many kitchen table histories are waiting for the same confirmation that the Ross family finally received? Harriet Tubman protected the how. She did it on purpose. She did it successfully. She did it in a way that has held for more than 150 years and will likely never be fully reconstructed, because she was too precise an operator to leave reconstructible evidence of methods that could still harm people. But the who and the where, the people she came from and the ground she learned on, those she could not protect from time and perhaps did not want to. Her descendants kept those details alive in exactly the form she would have recognized. Spoken, passed down, held inside families who understood that memory is its own kind of documentation, and that some records are more durable than paper precisely because they live in people rather than in buildings that can burn. 2 scientific teams confirmed what those people always knew. The line ran unbroken. The land was exactly where the family said it was, and the woman at the center of it all was exactly who her descendants always told each other she was. She stood 5 feet tall. She carried a permanent head injury. She went back 13 times. She never lost a single person. She died with almost nothing and left behind one of the most precisely constructed legacies in American history, protecting what needed to be protected and trusting her family to hold what she could not commit to paper. They held it. For nearly 200 years they held it, and now science has finally caught up to what they always knew.